People lived in settlements between two rivers in a region where the climate was warm. The rivers provided water that was essential for the settlements and for the fields nearby. Homes were built from mud bricks that had been shaped and dried in the sun. The bricks were made in standard sizes and stacked to form walls for structures used. The roofs were made from reeds and mud layered over wooden beams supporting them. Fields surrounded the settlements and were worked by people who lived in the homes there. The fields grew barley, wheat, and other crops suited to the soil and climate conditions. Water from the rivers was directed to the fields through channels dug for this purpose. The channels required regular clearing to maintain the flow of water to the plants growing. The work of clearing channels was performed by those who depended on the water flowing. Grain was stored in large containers made from clay or in designated storage structures built. The grain had been harvested from the fields and brought to the settlements for keeping. The containers protected the grain from moisture and from creatures that might consume it otherwise. The stored grain would be used gradually over time until the next harvest occurred again. The grinding of grain into flour was done using flat stones worked by hand daily. Bread was made from the flour mixed with water and shaped into flat rounds. The dough was placed on heated surfaces or in simple ovens to bake until done. The bread provided the main food consumed by most people living in the settlements here. The preparation of bread occurred each day following methods that had been used for generations. The process required time and effort but was necessary for sustaining the people there regularly. Animals were kept near the settlements in enclosures or allowed to graze in nearby areas. Sheep and goats were common and provided wool, milk, and meat for the people keeping them. The animals required water and feed provided by those who owned or tended them each day. Children or adults moved the animals to grazing areas and brought them back to enclosures regularly. The care of animals was part of the daily work performed by households in the settlements. Water was carried from the rivers or from canals to homes for use in various tasks. The carrying was done using clay vessels or leather bags that could hold the water. The water was used for drinking, cooking, washing, and other purposes throughout each day regularly. The paths between water sources and homes were well worn from constant use over time. The task of carrying water was repeated each day by those who needed it. Craftsmen made objects from clay, metal, wood, and other materials available in the region or obtained. Potters shaped clay into vessels and other items needed for daily use by the people. The clay was formed by hand or on wheels and then dried before being fired. The firing made the clay hard so it could hold liquids or store dry materials. The finished pottery was used in homes or traded to others who needed these items. Tools were made from stone, bronze, or other materials shaped for specific tasks performed regularly. The tools were used for cutting, digging, scraping, and other work necessary for daily life. Maintenance of tools involved sharpening or repairing them when they became worn from regular use. The tools were essential for the work that sustained the settlements and the people living there. Morning began when light appeared over the horizon in the eastern direction each day. People woke from sleep and began moving from their sleeping areas to other parts of homes. The sleeping areas had mats or simple platforms where people had rested during the night hours. The waking occurred gradually as light increased and the day's activities would soon begin for all. The transition from sleep to waking followed familiar patterns known to everyone in the households. Water was needed for washing and for preparing the first meal of the day each morning. The water was fetched from canals or from storage vessels kept inside the home structures. Small amounts of water were used for washing faces and hands after waking from the night. The water was used carefully to avoid waste of this resource brought from sources outside homes. The washing was quick and efficient, using only what was needed for the immediate purpose. The first meal consisted of bread from the previous day or grain prepared in simple ways. The food was eaten without elaborate preparation or lengthy time spent on the meal itself. People sat in areas designated for eating within the home or just outside the entrance. The meal provided energy for the work that would occupy most of the daylight hours available. The eating was done quietly with little conversation during this early time of the day. After eating, people began the tasks assigned to them by custom and household need understood. Men left homes to work in fields or at specialized crafts in workshop areas nearby. Women began tasks related to food preparation, cloth making, or household maintenance activities that were needed. Children helped with simple tasks appropriate to their size and developing abilities over the years. The division of labor was understood and followed without discussion or variation from the patterns. Grain grinding began early and continued for hours to produce enough flour needed for the day. The grinding stones were heavy and required strength to move back and forth across the grain. The motion was repetitive and had to be sustained over long periods to produce sufficient flour. The sound of grinding could be heard from multiple homes as women worked at this simultaneously. The flour accumulated gradually in containers placed beside the grinding stones for collection when finished. Canals required regular attention to keep them clear and functioning properly for water delivery to fields. Workers walked along the canals checking for blockages or damage that needed repair and attention now. Debris was removed by hand and placed on the banks to dry in the sun. The sides of canals were inspected for erosion and repaired with mud when necessary for stability. The maintenance of canals was ongoing work that could not be neglected without consequences for crops. Fields were visited by workers who performed the tasks needed for the crops growing there. The work included removing weeds that competed with the desired plants for water and nutrients available. Water levels in irrigation channels were checked and adjusted to ensure plants received adequate moisture daily. The soil around plants was loosened with tools to improve drainage and air circulation around roots. The field work was repetitive and familiar, requiring little conscious thought about what needed doing. Bread baking occurred after sufficient flour had been ground and prepared into dough for this. The dough was mixed with water and kneaded until it reached the proper consistency for shaping. The shaped dough was placed on hot stones or in ovens to bake until it was done. The baking required attention to prevent burning while ensuring the bread was cooked thoroughly throughout inside. The finished bread was removed and set aside to cool before it would be consumed. Pottery making involved shaping clay into vessels of various sizes needed by households for storage. The potter worked clay by hand or used a wheel that turned as the pot was shaped. The shaping required skill developed over years of practice and observation of experienced potters working. Each vessel was formed carefully and then set aside to dry before firing could occur later. The finished pottery was used for storing grain, water, oil, and other materials needed by people. Weaving took place in homes or in covered areas where looms were set up for this. The threads were prepared by spinning wool or plant fibers into long continuous strands for use. The loom held threads in position while other threads were passed through them in patterns repeatedly. The weaving created fabric that would become clothing or other textile items needed by the people. The work progressed slowly as each pass of thread added only a small amount of fabric. Animals grazed in areas where grass or other plants were available for them to consume. The animals were watched by children or adults who ensured they did not wander too far away. The animals returned to enclosures near the settlement when the sun began to descend toward horizon. The enclosures were simple structures that kept animals together during the night hours for safety. Feed and water were provided to animals in the enclosures before people returned to their homes. Midday brought the strongest heat and the brightest light to the settlement and the surroundings. Work slowed or paused during the hottest hours when physical labor became more difficult to sustain. People sought shade in homes or under structures built to provide protection from the sun. Water was consumed more frequently during this time to replace what was lost through perspiration occurring. The pause in work was necessary for health and comfort during the hottest part of day. Food preparation for the midday meal began as the heat started to diminish slightly from peak. The meal was usually simple, consisting of bread, grain preparations, or vegetables when these were available. The food was prepared over small fires or using heat retained in ovens from earlier baking. The cooking was done efficiently using methods refined through years of daily practice and repeated use. The meal was eaten in the same locations used for the morning meal taken earlier. After the midday meal and rest, work resumed as temperatures became more tolerable for labor. The afternoon work continued tasks begun in the morning or started new tasks as needed. The pace of work was steady but not rushed as people moved through their familiar routines. The work would continue until light began to fade and the day moved toward evening approaching. The progression from midday to evening followed the same pattern each day without significant variation observed. Craft workers continued their specialized tasks in workshops or designated work areas throughout the afternoon hours. Metal workers heated copper or bronze and shaped it into tools, weapons, or other objects needed. The specialized work required skills learned over many years of training and practice with these materials. The products were used locally or traded to other settlements for goods not made here. The craft production was part of the economic activity that sustained the communities living in this region. Children played in open areas between homes when not occupied with assigned tasks or chores. The play involved simple games using stones, sticks, or other objects found in the surrounding area. Adults worked nearby and could observe children while continuing their own tasks and daily responsibilities. The sounds of children playing mixed with the sounds of work being done throughout the settlement. The play provided physical activity and social interaction among children of similar ages living in proximity. Elders sat in shaded locations and sometimes worked on light tasks suited to their physical capabilities. They repaired items, sorted materials, or prepared things that others would use in their daily work. Their knowledge was valued and younger people asked questions or sought advice from them regularly about tasks. The presence of elders provided continuity with earlier generations and their accumulated experience over many decades. The respect for elders was shown through attention and assistance with their needs as they arose. Maintenance of homes involved checking walls, roofs, and structures for problems needing attention to prevent deterioration. Small repairs were made as issues were noticed before they became larger problems requiring extensive work. The mud bricks sometimes needed replacement if they had cracked or crumbled from age or weather. The roofs required periodic renewal of the reed and mud layers that covered the structures beneath. The maintenance work was ongoing and never fully completed but only kept at manageable levels overall. Tools were cleaned and sharpened as needed to keep them functional for the work they performed. Stone tools were resharpened by carefully striking them to create new sharp edges when edges dulled. Wooden handles were checked for cracks and replaced if they showed signs of failing from use. The tools were stored in designated places when not in use to protect them from damage. Proper care of tools extended their useful life and maintained their effectiveness for their intended purposes. The late afternoon saw the completion of work begun earlier and preparation for the evening hours. People returned from fields carrying tools that had been used during the day's labor in fields. Animals were secured in their enclosures and given feed and water for the night that approached. The settlements became busier with movement as people converged back toward their homes from various work locations. The transition from afternoon work to evening rest began as the sun moved lower in sky. Evening preparations began as the day's work came to its natural conclusion with the fading light. Fires were built or rekindled for cooking the evening meal in outdoor or designated indoor cooking areas. Fuel for fires consisted of dried plant materials, animal waste, or wood when it was available. The fires were tended carefully to maintain heat needed for cooking without wasting precious fuel resources. Smoke rose from multiple homes as cooking activities began throughout the settlement at similar times. The evening meal was prepared using ingredients gathered or stored from previous harvests and daily work. Vegetables were cleaned and cut using knives made from stone or metal shaped for this purpose. Grain was cooked in water to make porridge or other simple preparations eaten regularly by people. The cooking took time as ingredients were combined and heated over fires built for this specific use. The preparation followed methods known and repeated each day with only minor variations in the ingredients. Families gathered for the evening meal in the same areas used for previous meals eaten together. The food was served in pottery vessels and eaten using hands or simple utensils that were available. The portions were distributed according to the needs and status of each family member who was present. Conversations during the meal were quiet and focused on simple observations about the day just past. The meal provided both nutrition and time for family members to be together briefly before sleep. After eating, vessels and cooking implements were cleaned using water and returned to their storage locations. The cleaning was done efficiently using minimal water for washing and rinsing of the items used. Food scraps were set aside for animals or disposed of in designated areas away from the homes. The cooking area was tidied and prepared for the next day's use in the morning hours. The cleanup was part of the evening routine completed before other activities or rest would begin. Children were prepared for sleep through simple washing and settling into sleeping areas designated for their use. Parents or older siblings helped younger children with these preparations as part of the evening routines. The sleeping areas were the same locations used each night, providing familiarity and comfort for the children. Light coverings were arranged depending on the expected temperature during the night hours that would follow. The household became quieter as preparations for sleep progressed through the established sequence of nightly actions. Stories might be shared briefly by elders to children gathered in the family group before sleep. The stories were familiar ones told many times before and known by most of the listeners. The narratives reinforced shared values and transmitted knowledge about customs and expectations within the community here. The storytelling was brief and did not extend long into the evening hours when rest was needed. The listeners remained quiet and attentive even when they knew the stories being told to them. Sleeping mats or platforms were arranged in positions used consistently each night without any change or variation. Each person had an established location where they slept relative to other family members who were nearby. The positioning reflected family structure and provided proximity for warmth and security during the hours of darkness. The arrangement was practical and based on space available within the home's interior layout and dimensions. The preparation for sleep followed the same sequence each evening, creating a predictable routine for everyone. The settlement became progressively quieter as families completed their evening activities and settled for the night. The sounds of daytime work were replaced by softer sounds of people moving inside their homes. Fires were reduced to coals that would provide minimal warmth and could be rekindled in the morning. Light from fires and from the moon, if present, provided the only illumination during the darkness. The transition from day to night was complete as the last activities ceased throughout the settlement. Night brought cooler temperatures and the absence of sunlight for the hours until dawn would return. Most people slept deeply after the physical work performed throughout the day that had just ended. Some people woke briefly during the night for various reasons before returning to sleep once more. The night provided necessary rest that allowed bodies to recover strength for another day of work. Sleep was valued as essential for maintaining the ability to work and function properly each day. Dogs kept by some families remained somewhat alert during nighttime, watching for unusual sounds or movements nearby. They would make noise if something unfamiliar approached the settlement during the dark hours of night. Their vigilance provided a measure of security that allowed people to sleep more peacefully through the night. The dogs were valued for this protective function in addition to other uses they served for households. Their presence was part of the settlement's normal composition of people and animals living together here. The hours of night passed slowly as the settlement rested in darkness and relative stillness throughout. The breathing of sleepers and occasional animal sounds were the main audible signs of life continuing. The streets were empty and the work areas were silent until morning would come once again. The night served its purpose of providing the rest period needed between days of work and labor. The pattern of day followed by night repeated in endless succession as time passed forward continually. Stars moved across the sky in patterns familiar to those who observed them regularly over time. The moon progressed through its cycle of phases, changing appearance from night to night quite gradually. These celestial changes marked the passage of time on a larger scale than the daily rhythms. Some people knew the patterns and used them for determining timing of planting or other important activities. Most people simply slept through the night without observing the sky above during the darkness hours. Pre-dawn hours brought the coolest temperatures of the entire day and night cycle combined together here. Additional coverings were drawn closer by those who felt the chill during this coldest period of darkness. Bodies naturally conserved warmth by remaining still and positioned close to others sleeping nearby on mats. The cool air made sleep deep and restorative for most people resting during these final hours. The temperature would begin rising again when the sun appeared over the horizon eventually at dawn. The first light of dawn appeared as a gradual brightening of the eastern sky above the horizon. The change was subtle at first and did not immediately wake those still sleeping inside their homes. Birds began making sounds as they sensed the approaching day and the return of sunlight and warmth. The transition from night to day was beginning, though most people remained asleep still for some time. The settlement would soon begin stirring as another day arrived, bringing the same activities as days before. Some people began waking as the light increased and penetrated into homes through openings that were present. They stirred on their sleeping surfaces but did not immediately rise to begin the day's work and tasks. The waking was gradual, allowing the transition from sleep to consciousness to occur naturally without any rush. Bodies became aware of the need to rise but remained at rest briefly longer before moving. The day would begin fully soon, but these moments were still part of the resting period. Morning routines would begin again as people rose and started preparing for another day of familiar work. The patterns would repeat as they had repeated yesterday and many days before that time in memory. Water would be fetched and grain would be ground and bread would be prepared as it was usual. Fields would be worked and crafts would be practiced and animals would be tended to as they were. The day would unfold according to rhythms established over many generations of people living in this place. The sun would rise over the landscape, bringing light and warmth to the settlement and the fields. The sunrise marked the beginning of the daily cycle that would continue until sunset would return again. People would perform their tasks following routines that were familiar and required little conscious thought to complete. The work would occupy most of the daylight hours available for productive activity and necessary labor. The day would pass in ways that were predictable and known to everyone who was participating. Meals would be prepared and eaten at the customary times using familiar foods and cooking methods. Families would gather together for these meals, providing regular breaks from work and time spent together. The social aspect of eating together reinforced family bonds and allowed communication of simple daily information. The meals would follow the same basic patterns as they had followed in previous days without change. The rhythm of meals marked the passage of time through each day in regular and predictable intervals. Evening would arrive, bringing the completion of work and the beginning of preparations for the night again. Fires would be lit for cooking and then reduced for the night ahead as they had been before. Sleeping areas would be prepared and families would settle into their established positions for rest and sleep. The household would become quiet as darkness deepened outside and sleep approached for all the members. The transition to night would occur as it had occurred countless times in the past before this. The patterns would continue day after day with only minor variations from the established daily routines. Seasons would bring some changes in temperature and the types of work performed at different times. The fundamental structure of daily life would remain constant despite these seasonal variations occurring in predictable ways. The community would maintain itself through the collective effort of all capable members who were contributing. Life would continue as it had continued for as long as anyone could remember clearly from before. Water continued to be carried from canals to homes in vessels made for this specific purpose. The paths between canals and homes were traveled multiple times each day by different people carrying water. The vessels were filled at the water's edge and carried carefully back to homes without spilling. The filled vessels were heavy and required care in carrying them back to the homes safely. The water was used for drinking, cooking, washing, and other purposes throughout each day without exception. Grain grinding occupied significant portions of time for women in most households throughout the settlements here. The grinding stones were positioned in areas where this work was regularly performed each day by women. The upper stone was moved back and forth across grain placed on the lower stone beneath. The motion had to be repeated thousands of times to produce sufficient flour for the daily needs. The work was physically demanding and caused strain on bodies performing this task over many long hours. Bread dough was prepared by mixing flour with water in proportions learned through years of daily practice. The mixture was kneaded by hand until it reached the consistency needed for shaping into loaves. The kneading required effort and time to develop the dough properly for baking that would follow. The dough was then formed into shapes that would be placed in ovens or on cooking surfaces. The shaping was done by hand following methods passed down through generations of bread makers here. Ovens were heated using fuel that had been collected and stored for this specific cooking use. The heating took time as the oven reached the temperature needed for proper baking to occur. The temperature was judged by experience rather than by any measuring device or method that was available. Bread was placed in the heated oven and left there while baking occurred over the required time. The baking required attention to prevent burning while ensuring thorough cooking of the dough that was placed. Wool processing began with shearing the sheep and cleaning the fibers harvested from the animals kept. The cleaning removed dirt and debris that were mixed with the fibers when they were removed. The cleaned fibers were then prepared for spinning into thread through further processing steps needed for this. The spinning twisted fibers together to create continuous thread that could be used for weaving into fabric. The thread was wound onto simple tools that kept it organized for later use in the weaving. Weaving involved setting up threads on a loom in a pattern that would create usable fabric. The cross threads were passed through the lengthwise threads in a regular alternating pattern that was repeated. Each pass of the cross thread added a small amount to the fabric being created on loom. The weaving progressed slowly as the fabric grew in length through many repetitions of this same action. The finished fabric was removed from the loom and could be cut and sewn into needed garments. Pottery vessels were shaped from clay prepared by removing stones and mixing with water to proper consistency. The clay was formed on a wheel that turned while the potter shaped the vessel carefully. The shaping required skill to create even walls and the desired form for the vessel being made. Each vessel was unique though similar in general appearance to others made for the same intended purpose. The shaped vessels were set aside to dry before they could be fired in kilns constructed for this. Firing of pottery occurred in kilns built specifically for creating the high temperatures needed for this process. The dried vessels were placed in the kiln and heat was applied over many hours of tending. The firing made the clay hard and able to hold liquids or dry materials without breaking apart. The temperature and duration of firing affected the final properties of the finished pottery that was created. The fired pottery was removed after cooling and was ready for use in households throughout the settlement. Brick making continued in areas where clay suitable for this purpose was available for extraction from ground. The clay was dug from the ground and transported to areas where bricks were formed into shapes. The clay was mixed with water and sometimes other materials to improve its working properties for forming. The mixture was pressed into wooden molds that created uniform brick shapes and standard sizes for building. The bricks were removed from molds and allowed to dry completely in the sun's heat over days. Dried bricks were used in construction or sometimes fired in kilns to make them harder and more durable. The bricks were stacked and stored in locations where they would be needed for building work. The production of bricks was ongoing to meet the continuous need for building and repairing structures. The bricks formed the walls of homes and other buildings constructed throughout the settlements in this region. The standardized sizes made the bricks easier to work with in construction of various structures needed. Fields required regular attention to maintain the crops growing there throughout the growing season that lasted. Weeds were removed by hand to prevent them from competing with desired plants for available resources. Water was directed through irrigation channels to areas where plants needed additional moisture for continued growth. The channels were checked and cleared of debris that blocked the flow of water to the fields. The work in fields was repetitive and had to be performed regularly without interruption or neglect. Planting occurred when the season was appropriate for the crops being grown in the prepared fields. Seeds were placed in soil that had been prepared through previous working and treatment of the land. The seeds were covered with soil and water was provided to initiate the growing process in plants. The spacing of seeds followed patterns learned through experience with these particular crops over many growing seasons. The planting period was busy as much work had to be completed within a limited time available. Harvesting brought increased activity when crops were ready to be gathered from the fields where they grew. The plants were cut using tools designed for this purpose and gathered into bundles for easier transport. The bundles were carried from fields to processing areas where further work would be done on them. The processing separated the edible or useful parts from the rest of the plant material not needed. The harvested material was then stored in containers or structures built for this specific storage purpose. Storage facilities protected grain and other materials from moisture, pests, and deterioration over time until it was needed. The facilities were designed with features that maintained appropriate conditions inside for preservation of the contents stored. Regular inspections ensured that stored materials remained in good condition without spoilage or loss that could occur. The storage of surplus production allowed communities to survive between harvest periods when nothing new was growing. The management of stored materials was important for the continuing survival of people living in these settlements. Tools used in various types of work were maintained through regular cleaning and repair as they were needed. Stone tools were resharpened when their edges became dull from use in cutting or scraping work performed. Wooden handles were checked for cracks or weakness and replaced before they failed during active use. Metal tools were cleaned and sometimes reshaped if they had become bent or damaged from the work. The maintenance of tools was necessary to keep them functional for the work they were designed to perform. Baskets were woven from plant materials gathered from areas where these plants grew naturally or were cultivated. The materials were prepared by soaking and sometimes splitting them to create flexible strands for the weaving. The weaving followed patterns that created baskets of different sizes and shapes for various intended uses. Each basket was made by hand using techniques learned through observation and practice over many years of work. The baskets were used for carrying, storing, and organizing items needed in daily life and work activities. Seals were carved from stone to create designs that could be pressed into clay surfaces for marking. The carving required precision and skill to create the desired design in reverse on the seal's surface. The seals were used to mark ownership or to authenticate documents created on clay tablets used for records. The impression left by a seal in soft clay was distinctive and could be recognized by others. The making and use of seals was part of administrative and trade activities conducted in the settlements. Writing occurred on clay tablets that were shaped and smoothed for this purpose of recording information. The writing was done using a stylus that made marks in the soft clay surface prepared. The marks represented words or numbers used in keeping records of various transactions and information needed. The tablets were dried or fired to preserve the information recorded on them for future reference. The practice of writing allowed information to be stored and communicated across time and distance between people. Trade occurred between settlements, allowing exchange of goods produced in different areas or by different specialist craftsmen. Boats traveled along the rivers carrying goods to other settlements located at various distances from each other. The boats were loaded with items to be traded and brought back goods received in exchange. The trade allowed people to obtain materials and products not available in their immediate area or settlements. The exchange of goods created economic connections between distant settlements along the river valleys over time passing. Markets or trading areas existed where people brought goods to exchange with others from their own settlements. The exchanges were conducted through direct negotiation between the parties involved in the transaction taking place there. The value of different goods was compared and agreed upon before the exchange was completed between parties. The trading provided opportunities for social interaction as well as economic exchange between people who were gathered. The markets operated on regular schedules that were known to all who participated in them regularly. The daily routines continued with rhythms that had been established over long periods of time passing. Morning began with waking and the simple preparations needed before work could start for the day. Water was fetched and food was prepared using methods that required no conscious thought to perform. The actions were familiar and had been repeated so many times that they felt completely automatic. The morning activities transitioned smoothly into the work that would occupy most of the daylight hours. Grinding continued in homes as women worked to produce the flour needed for the daily bread. The sound of stone against stone was heard from multiple locations as this work progressed steadily. The motion was steady and rhythmic as the upper stone moved back and forth repeatedly over grain. The flour accumulated slowly in containers placed beside the grinding area for collection when sufficient quantity was reached. The work continued until enough flour had been produced to meet the household's needs for today. Baking followed the grinding once sufficient flour had been prepared and mixed with water to form dough. The dough was shaped and placed in ovens that had been heated to the appropriate temperature needed. The baking took time as the heat transformed the dough into bread that could be eaten. The bread was removed when it appeared done based on visual inspection and accumulated experience with the baking. The finished bread was set aside to cool before it would be consumed during the meals. Water carrying occurred throughout the day as various needs arose requiring this essential resource for daily use. The vessels were filled at canals and carried back to homes where the water would be used. The carrying was done by women and children who made multiple trips each day between water sources. The water was used for drinking, cooking, washing, and other purposes that required it regularly throughout the day. The supply of water had to be replenished constantly as it was consumed or used for tasks. Fields were worked by people who traveled to them each day from their homes in the settlements. The work involved tasks appropriate to the season and the stage of crop growth that was observed. Weeds were removed and water was directed and soil was worked as needed for the plants. The workers moved through fields following patterns that ensured all areas received attention over time in a regular way. The field work continued day after day throughout the growing season without interruption or any pause. Animals grazed in areas where vegetation was available for them to consume during the daylight hours. The animals were watched to ensure they did not stray too far from the designated grazing areas. Children or adults assigned to this task stayed with the animals throughout the entire grazing period. The animals moved slowly as they ate their way across the available vegetation in the surrounding area. The grazing continued until it was time to return the animals to their enclosures near the settlements. Craft work progressed in workshops or designated areas where specialized tasks were performed by skilled workers daily. Potters shaped clay and weavers worked at looms, and metal workers heated and shaped metals into forms. Each craft had its own methods and tools that were specific to that particular type of work. The craftsmen worked steadily, producing items that would be used locally or traded to others living elsewhere. The craft production was part of the economic activity that sustained communities living in this entire region. Maintenance work occurred continuously as structures and systems required attention to remain functional over time, passing steadily. Walls were checked for cracks and repaired with new bricks or mud applied to damaged areas. Canals were cleared of accumulated debris that blocked the flow of water through them to the fields. Roofs were inspected and repaired if materials had shifted or deteriorated from exposure to weather and time. The maintenance was never finished, but only kept at a level that prevented major failures from occurring. Children learned by observing and participating in the work performed by adults around them each day. Boys watched fathers and other men as they worked at their various tasks and daily responsibilities. Girls observed mothers and other women as they performed the work assigned to them by established custom. The learning was informal and occurred through direct participation rather than through formal instruction given in separate sessions. The knowledge and skills were transmitted from one generation to the next through this daily close interaction. Elders provided guidance based on their accumulated experience over many years of living and working in this place. They answered questions and offered advice when it was sought by younger people around them in households. They performed light tasks that did not require the physical strength needed for heavier work in fields. Their presence connected the current generation to earlier times and to the knowledge accumulated then over long periods. The elders were respected for their age and experience and were cared for by their extended families. Meals were eaten at regular times, providing breaks from work and opportunities for family interaction together in groups. The food was simple and consisted mainly of bread and grain preparations with occasional vegetables when available. The meals were consumed in the same locations used for previous meals without variation from established patterns. The eating provided both nutrition and a brief period of rest before work would resume once again. The pattern of meals structured the day into segments marked by these regular eating times that occurred. Midday brought the strongest heat, making physical work difficult during these hours of the entire day. Most people paused their work and rested in shaded areas until the heat began to diminish somewhat. Water was consumed to replace what had been lost through perspiration during the morning work that was performed. The rest period was necessary for health and allowed people to continue working when afternoon would come. The midday pause was a regular part of each day's rhythm during the warmer seasons of the year. Afternoon work resumed when the temperature had decreased enough to make labor tolerable once more for workers. The tasks continued from where they had been left off during the midday rest period that was taken. The work proceeded at a steady pace that could be sustained throughout the remaining daylight hours still available. The afternoon was productive time when much work was accomplished before evening approached and ended the working day. The transition from afternoon to evening occurred gradually as the sun moved lower in the western sky. Field work in the afternoon involved checking irrigation channels and adjusting water flow as needed for the crops. Plants were inspected for signs of pests or disease that required attention or treatment to prevent spreading. Weeds that had been missed in earlier work were removed by hand from around the growing plants. The condition of crops was assessed and noted for future reference and planning of additional work needed. Each field received attention according to its specific needs and the crops that were growing there. Animal care continued throughout the afternoon as herds returned from grazing areas to the settlements' enclosures nearby. The animals were counted to ensure none had been lost during the day's grazing in the fields. Water troughs were filled and feed was provided for animals in their enclosures for the coming night. Young animals were checked for signs of illness or injury that needed treatment from those caring for them. The daily routine of animal care was performed consistently to maintain herd health over time passing steadily. Craft work continued in workshops and open areas as the afternoon hours passed toward evening approaching slowly. Potters shaped additional vessels and set them aside to dry before firing would occur much later. Weavers worked at their looms making steady progress on cloth being produced for various uses planned. Basket makers gathered and prepared materials for the next day's work ahead that would need these supplies. The afternoon was productive time for craftsmen working on their various projects consistently without rushing the work. Women continued food preparation work that had begun earlier in the day throughout the afternoon hours. Ingredients were prepared for the evening meal that would be consumed after sunset when work had ended. Dough was set aside to rise before being shaped and baked later in the cooling evening. Vegetables were cleaned and cut ready for cooking when the time came for meal preparation to begin. The work of preparing food occupied significant portions of each day for most women in the households. Children returned from their play and began helping with afternoon tasks as directed by the adults. They carried water, gathered fuel, or performed other simple tasks assigned to them by household members. Older children took on more responsibility and worked alongside adults learning through practice and direct observation. The participation of children in household work was expected and considered normal training for their future roles. Their contributions, though modest, were valued as part of the household's collective effort to sustain itself. Elders sat in shaded areas during midday discussing matters of interest to the community and its members. Their conversations covered past experiences, current concerns, and observations about village life in general and specific matters. Younger people sometimes listened to gain knowledge from the accumulated wisdom of older generations who had lived longer. The elders' perspective was valued and their opinions were considered in community decisions when these were needed. The midday gathering of elders was a regular feature of village life and the established social structure. The midday rest continued as the sun reached its highest point in the sky above the settlement. The heat made movement uncomfortable and work inefficient during these hours of strongest sunlight shining down. Most people remained in shaded areas waiting for the temperature to decrease somewhat before resuming their tasks. Water was sipped slowly to maintain hydration without consuming the limited supply too quickly at once. The rest period was accepted as necessary rather than optional in the daily schedule that was followed. Afternoon work would resume when the sun had descended enough to reduce the heat experienced by workers. The timing was judged by the position of the sun and the feel of the air. There was no precise moment when work resumed but rather a gradual return to the activity. People began moving from shaded rest areas back toward their work locations in fields or workshops. The transition from rest to work occurred naturally as the day progressed toward evening hours that would follow. Bread baking occurred during the afternoon once ovens had reached proper temperature for this important task. Shaped loaves were placed carefully into ovens heated by fires built earlier in the day for this. The baking required attention to prevent burning while ensuring thorough cooking of the dough that was placed. The smell of baking bread spread through the village, signaling this daily activity to all who were present. Fresh bread would be available for the evening meal and the following day's consumption by the household. Field work resumed with tasks that had been set aside during the midday heat that had paused activity. Irrigation water was checked and adjusted to compensate for evaporation during the hot hours that had passed. Workers moved more slowly in the afternoon heat but continued their necessary tasks steadily without rushing. The crops required attention regardless of the temperature or comfort of the workers tending them in fields. The work continued as it had to if harvests were to be successful later in the season. Animal herds began returning from grazing areas as afternoon progressed toward evening hours that were approaching ahead. Children or herders guided the animals back toward the village and their enclosures located there for nighttime. The animals moved willingly, knowing that water and shelter awaited them at journey's end in the settlement. Dust rose from the paths as hooves disturbed the dry earth during the return walk to enclosures. The movement of animals back to the village was a daily pattern repeated without variation from before. Craft production continued in workshops as afternoon light remained adequate for detailed work that was needed. Potters removed dried pieces from earlier work and prepared them for firing in kilns built for this. Weavers made steady progress on cloth production, working at sustainable pace throughout the afternoon hours without stopping. The afternoon was productive time, though perhaps less so than the cooler morning hours had been. The craftsmen worked toward daily production goals that maintained their income and household needs being met. Women completed bread baking and began preparations for the evening meal that would come later after sunset. Vegetables were prepared and ingredients were assembled for the cooking that would occur at day's end. The work of food preparation occupied substantial portions of women's time throughout each day without exception. The meals were similar from day to day, reducing the complexity of planning and preparation that was needed. The familiar routines made the work manageable despite the time required to complete it all properly. Children helped with afternoon tasks appropriate to their age and developing capabilities over time as they grew. Older children took on more responsibility while younger ones performed simpler tasks under supervision from adults. The participation of children in household work was normal and expected by all members of the community. The work taught skills and also contributed meaningfully to the household's functioning and survival in this place. Children learned through doing rather than through formal instruction in most cases that occurred daily. Market activity decreased as afternoon progressed and merchants prepared to return to their homes and settlements. Final transactions were completed and remaining goods were packed for transport back to storage locations designated. The marketplace would empty gradually as people departed for their homes in the village or nearby areas. The market operated on regular schedules that were understood by all who participated in the trading. The rhythm of market activity was part of the larger pattern of community life in the region. Canal traffic continued with boats making final trips before evening darkness made navigation more difficult to accomplish safely. Crews worked to complete deliveries and return to home ports before nightfall when this was possible. The canals remained busy until light began to fade from the western sky completely into darkness. Navigation in darkness was possible but more challenging and therefore avoided when circumstances permitted safe timing. The canal rhythm followed the sun's cycle through the day like other activities did throughout the settlement. Temple activities continued with afternoon rituals and administrative work by priests throughout the day as it progressed. Records were updated and preparations were made for the next day's ceremonies and functions that were scheduled. The temple operated on schedules separate from but coordinated with agricultural and community rhythms around it here. The priests maintained their specialized roles serving religious and administrative needs of the broader community living nearby. The temple presence was constant in the background of daily village life, always there for the people. Fishing crews returned to shore with afternoon catches to be processed before darkness fell over the water. The fish were cleaned and distributed to families or prepared for preservation through drying in the sun. Nets were inspected and repaired as needed to maintain them in good working condition for next use. The fishing equipment was stored properly to protect it from damage and deterioration overnight when not being used. Fishing provided important supplemental food that varied the diet beyond grain-based staples consumed daily by people. Tools used in fields during the day were cleaned and stored in designated locations for safekeeping overnight. The cleaning removed dirt and debris that could cause damage if left on the tools over time. Proper storage protected tools from weather and theft during the night hours when they were unattended. The care of tools was important as they were valuable and not easily replaced if they were lost. Each household maintained its tools through regular cleaning and periodic sharpening or repair as they were needed. Water jars were refilled for evening and nighttime needs in households throughout the village and surrounding areas. The water was carried from the canals in the same daily trips that had occurred earlier. Fresh water was preferred for drinking and cooking, while older water was used for washing and cleaning. The water carrying continued until sufficient supply was available for anticipated needs until morning would come. The work of water carrying was constant and necessary every single day without any exception ever. Firewood and fuel were gathered for evening cooking fires and nighttime warmth if it was needed. Children collected small sticks and dried plant materials from areas near the village designated for this purpose. The fuel was stored near cooking areas for convenient access when needed for fires to be built. Adequate fuel was essential for cooking the evening meal and maintaining some warmth overnight if required. The gathering of fuel was ongoing work that required daily attention to maintain adequate supplies for use. Cooking fires were built as the sun approached the horizon and evening approached the settlement steadily now. Wood and dried materials were arranged and lit using coals from fires maintained during the day. The fires were built up to provide heat for cooking the prepared ingredients for the evening meal. Pots were placed over fires and their contents were monitored as cooking progressed slowly over the flames. The evening meal preparation followed the same pattern each day with only minor variations in the ingredients. Animals were secured in their enclosures as evening approached and darkness would soon follow after sunset. Gates were checked and fastened to prevent animals from wandering during the night ahead into the fields. Feed and water were provided to ensure animals were comfortable through the night hours of darkness. The animals settled into their enclosures with familiar sounds of movement and occasional calls to each other. The securing of animals completed the transition from day work to evening rest routines that were followed. Men returned from fields as daylight faded and work became difficult to continue safely in diminishing light. They walked along familiar paths back to the village carrying tools used during the day's work. The return was gradual as different workers finished their tasks at slightly different times throughout the afternoon. Dust from the paths hung in the still evening air as groups walked homeward toward their dwellings. The day's field work was complete and would resume again tomorrow morning as it always did. Evening washing removed the dirt and dust accumulated during the day's work and activities in the fields. Water was used to clean hands, faces, and feet before the evening meal was served to families. The washing was done outside near cooking areas using water provided for this purpose from storage vessels. Clean garments were put on if available, or dirty ones were brushed to remove loose dirt and debris. The washing marked the transition from work to rest and the evening meal that was approaching soon. Families gathered for the evening meal as cooking was completed and food was ready for consumption. The gathering occurred in the same locations used for previous meals throughout many days that had passed. Elders were served first, followed by other family members in established order of respect and age. The food was simple but adequate to satisfy hunger after the day's physical labor in the fields. The meal provided both nutrition and opportunity for family connection at the end of the day. Conversations during the evening meal were quiet and focused on simple daily matters that had been observed. Events of the day might be mentioned briefly without elaborate discussion or analysis of their significance. Children shared observations from their play or work done during the day just passed before them. The conversations were relaxed and unhurried as there was no pressure to finish the meal quickly. The social aspect of eating together was valued as much as the food that was consumed. The evening meal concluded as people finished eating the portions provided to them earlier at the gathering. Dishes and cooking implements were gathered for cleaning before darkness made work more difficult to accomplish properly. Water was used to wash items, which were then stored in their usual places for next use. Food scraps were set aside for animals or disposed of away from the home in designated areas. The cleanup transitioned the household toward evening rest and preparation for sleep that would follow soon. Fires were reduced to glowing coals that would provide minimal warmth through the night hours ahead. The reduction of fires saved fuel and reduced the risk of uncontrolled burning overnight when people slept. Some light remained from the coals, allowing movement inside homes during early darkness hours before full sleep. The fire would be rebuilt in the morning from these preserved coals to begin another day. Fire management continued through the evening as part of the daily cycle of household maintenance and care. Evening activities were limited as darkness made most work impossible without adequate lighting sources for tasks. Some simple tasks could be done by firelight if necessary, but most work had ceased by now. Families sat together near fires, talking quietly or preparing directly for sleep that would come ahead soon. The evening was a time of rest rather than continued labor after the long day of work. The rhythm of the day moved naturally towards sleep as darkness enveloped the village completely outside homes. Stories might be shared during evening hours when families gathered before sleeping would begin for everyone present. The stories were familiar ones told many times before by elders to younger listeners in the group. The narratives reinforced cultural values and shared knowledge across generations through repeated telling over time passing. Children listened even though they knew the stories well from previous hearings of the same tales. The storytelling was brief as fatigue from the day's work made everyone ready for rest and sleep. Sleeping mats were unrolled and positioned in locations used every night by each household member without variation. The positioning followed established patterns, with children near parents and elders in preferred spots within the home. Light coverings were gathered and placed nearby for use during the night if they were needed. The preparation for sleep followed the same sequence each night, creating familiar routine for all members present. The household settled towards sleep as the final activity of the day before rest would occur. The village became progressively quieter as families prepared for sleep in their homes located nearby each other. The sounds of evening activity faded, leaving only the sounds of night emerging instead of daytime noises. Insects began their nighttime chorus as darkness settled over the village and surrounding fields completely now. The transition from day to night was complete as the last activity ceased throughout the settlement. The village rested as people slept through the hours of darkness until dawn would return once more. Night brought cooler temperatures and the absence of light from the sun that had now set. The darkness was nearly complete except for faint moonlight when the moon was present in the sky. Most people slept deeply after the physical exertion of the day's work performed throughout the daylight. The night provided essential rest that allowed bodies to recover for another similar day of work. Sleep was valued and protected as necessary for maintaining health and ability to work properly each day. Dogs remained alert during the night, watching for threats to the village and households within the settlement. They would bark if unusual sounds or movements occurred near the village during the darkness hours. Their warnings alerted people to potential dangers from animals or other threats approaching the settlement nearby. The dogs were valued for this protective function they performed throughout each night without fail. Their presence was part of the village's defense against threats that might come in the darkness. The hours of night passed slowly while most people slept undisturbed in their homes throughout the settlement. The village was still except for occasional animal sounds from enclosures or distant areas beyond the settlement. The canals continued flowing past, making soft sounds that blended with insect choruses in the night. The natural sounds of night were familiar and did not disturb the sleep of villagers resting peacefully. The night served its purpose of providing rest before another day would begin at dawn's arrival. Pre-dawn hours brought the coolest temperatures of the entire day and night cycle that was experienced. Additional coverings were used by those who felt the chill during these hours before sunrise would come. Bodies naturally conserved warmth by curling slightly and remaining still during sleep in these cold periods. The cool air was refreshing and made sleep deep and restorative for most people resting now. The temperature would rise again once the sun appeared over the horizon in the eastern direction. The first hints of dawn appeared as a faint lightening of the eastern sky above the horizon. The change was gradual and almost imperceptible at first to those still sleeping inside their homes. The stars began to fade as the sky slowly brightened with the approaching sunrise that was coming. Birds began calling softly as they sensed the coming of day and new light returning to Earth. The transition from night to day had begun, though most people still slept peacefully in their homes. Some people began to wake as the pre-dawn light increased enough to penetrate their homes through openings. They stirred on their mats but did not yet rise to begin the day's work and tasks. The awakening was gradual, allowing the transition from sleep to waking to occur naturally and gently without rushing. Bodies became aware of the need to rise but remained at rest briefly longer before moving. The day would begin soon, but not quite yet in these quiet moments before full dawn. The established patterns would repeat themselves as they had the previous day and before that time. Work would be performed in fields and homes according to familiar routines known well to all participants. Meals would be prepared and consumed at customary times throughout the day ahead as they were always. Animals would be tended and children would play in open areas between homes as they did always. The day would unfold in ways that were predictable and understood by all community members living here. The canals would continue flowing past the village as they always had for all memory and time. Water would be carried to homes and fields for the many purposes it served daily without exception. Boats would move on the water carrying goods between communities along its length as they did usual. Fish would be caught and reeds would be harvested from areas near the water's edge as needed. The canal's presence would shape the day as they shaped every day in this place along the water. Fields would be checked and tended according to the needs of crops growing there in the prepared soil. Irrigation channels would be cleared and water flow would be adjusted as required for plant growth to continue. Weeds would be removed and pests would be deterred from damaging the crops being cultivated with care. The work would continue as it had yesterday and would continue tomorrow after that as it always did. The cycles of agricultural work continued through the seasons year after year without any end in sight. Craftsmen would work at their various trades producing items needed by the community regularly without pause. Potters would shape clay and fire vessels in their kilns as they had done before this day. Weavers would work at their looms creating cloth from plant fibers gathered and processed earlier in time. Basket makers would weave containers from reeds collected along the canal's edge as they always did. The production of necessary items continued steadily to meet the ongoing needs of households in the settlement. Women would grind grain and prepare bread as they did each day without exception or variation. The repetitive labor would occupy hours of their time as it always had previously in the past. Children would help with water carrying and other tasks assigned to them by the adults around them. Families would gather for meals and rest during the hottest hours of the afternoon ahead as usual. The domestic routines would unfold in their customary patterns familiar to all household members living there. Elders would sit in shaded areas sharing stories and advice with younger generations around them who listened. Their presence would provide continuity and connection to earlier times and past experiences valuable to remember well. They would perform light tasks suited to their abilities, contributing what they could to community efforts ongoing. The community would care for them as they had cared for others when they were younger. The respect for elders would be demonstrated through attention and small acts of service as it always was. Trade would occur in designated areas where people brought goods to exchange with others from nearby settlements. Farmers would offer grain and vegetables while craftsmen would bring their produced items to trade for necessities. Negotiations would be conducted and exchanges would be completed according to established customs and practices known to all. The economic life of the community would continue functioning as it had in the past without change. The trade provided necessary distribution of goods among those who needed various items regularly for their use. Children would learn through watching and gradually participating in the work around them daily without formal instruction. Boys would learn from fathers and male relatives the skills needed for their future work in fields. Girls would learn from mothers and female relatives the domestic skills they would need in their own lives. The education occurred naturally through daily life rather than through formal instruction given in separate teaching sessions. Knowledge and skills passed from generation to generation through this informal but effective method that had been used. The sun would rise higher, bringing increasing heat to the villages and fields below them during the day. Work would slow during the hottest midday hours as people sought shade and rest from the labor. Activity would resume in the afternoon as temperatures became more tolerable for physical labor again being performed. Evening would arrive, bringing cooler air and the completion of the day's required work that was accomplished. The cycle of the day would move from dawn through midday to evening predictably each time without variation. Meals would mark the day's progression, providing breaks from work and opportunities for social interaction among family members. Food would be prepared from familiar ingredients using methods unchanged for many generations that had passed before. Families would gather to eat together, strengthening bonds between members through shared time together in the group. The meals would sustain bodies and provide the energy needed for continued work and activity throughout the day. The social and nutritional aspects of eating were both important to community functioning well in this place. Evening would bring preparations for sleep as darkness approached the village once again tonight, as it always did. Fires would be lit for cooking and then banked for the night ahead as they had been before. Sleeping mats would be unrolled and positioned in their usual locations inside each home as they were always. Children would settle near parents and the household would become quiet as darkness deepened outside the dwellings. The transition to night and sleep would occur as it had occurred countless times before this present time. The patterns would continue without significant change from one day to the next, passing by in steady succession. Seasons would bring variations in temperature and types of work performed during different months of the year. The flooding of the canals would come and go according to its cycle that was known to all. Planting and harvest would occur at their appointed times, determined by natural rhythms observed over many years. But the basic structure of life would remain constant despite these seasonal variations occurring in predictable ways. Generations would succeed one another, maintaining the same ways of living and working together in this place. Children would grow to adulthood and form their own families, continuing the patterns they had learned. Elders would age and eventually die to be replaced by those who followed them in the succession. The community would persist through time, carried forward by successive generations of people living here together always. The continuity would be maintained through the transmission of knowledge and skills from old to young people. The village would continue existing along the canals as it had for a very long time before. The homes would be maintained and rebuilt as needed to shelter the families living there in the settlement. The fields would be worked season after season, providing food for the community's needs that were ongoing. The relationship with the canals would remain central to survival and prosperity in this region of the land. Life would continue in its established patterns, shaped by environment and tradition, both together forming the whole. The night would deepen as people slept through its hours, resting from their labors performed during daylight. The darkness would eventually give way to dawn and another day similar to this one just past. The sun would rise again over the canals, beginning the cycle once more as it had done before. Work would resume and life would continue in its familiar rhythms and patterns known to all participants. The days would follow one another in succession, stretching forward through time ahead without any end visible. Sleep provided the necessary rest for bodies to recover strength for continuing the work that was required. The night hours allowed for restoration of energy depleted by the day's activities and labor in the fields. Dreams might come and go, but the essential purpose was rest and recovery for all people sleeping. The quiet darkness surrounded the village as people rested peacefully in their homes nearby each other here. Morning would come eventually, bringing light and the beginning of another day ahead again very soon now. The patterns would repeat themselves day after day through the weeks and months passing by in time. The work would continue and the community would maintain itself through collective effort sustained by all members. The canals would flow and the sun would rise and the seasons would turn through their familiar cycles. Life would continue along the canals as it had for countless generations before this present time now. The rhythms were steady and reliable, providing structure and predictability to existence there in that place always. The village rested in complete stillness as the deepest part of night held everything in its grasp. The breathing of sleepers was slow and regular, creating soft sounds barely audible in the darkness surrounding. The mats beneath them provided minimal cushioning from the hard floors of packed earth below their bodies. Bodies had grown accustomed to this firmness through years of sleeping on similar surfaces nightly without exception. Comfort was found more in exhaustion and rest than in softness of sleeping arrangements provided for them. Storage jars stood along the walls of homes holding grain and other provisions carefully kept for later use. The jars were sealed to protect contents from moisture and pests during the night hours of darkness. The stored food represented security and survival for the families who depended on these supplies being available. Periodic checks during daylight hours ensured that nothing was spoiling or being consumed by rodents or other pests. The preservation of stored food was essential for surviving between harvest periods throughout the year without other sources. Tools lay where they had been placed after the day's work was completed earlier in the evening. They would be taken up again when morning came and work resumed in the fields once more. The tools were simple but essential for the work they were designed to perform for their owners. Without them, the necessary labor of agriculture could not be accomplished efficiently or at all in the fields. The care and maintenance of tools was therefore important to everyone who used them regularly in their work. Woven mats hung on walls or lay folded in corners waiting to be used tomorrow for various purposes. The mats served multiple purposes, from sitting surfaces to covers for items needing protection from dust and dirt. They wore out from use and needed replacement regularly as part of household maintenance that was ongoing. The skills to make mats were common and materials were readily available from the canals and nearby areas. Each household produced what it needed or traded with others who specialized in mat making for the community. Doorways stood open or covered with simple hangings that moved slightly in night breezes passing through the settlement. The openings allowed air to circulate through the interior spaces during warm nights when this was needed. In cooler weather, the openings were covered more completely to retain warmth inside the homes during night. The adjustment of coverings was done according to temperature and comfort needs, varying by the season. The homes were designed to accommodate the climate conditions experienced throughout the year in this particular region. The night continued, holding the village in its darkness and stillness as hours passed slowly through time. The sleep continued, providing the rest that bodies needed for recovery from work done during the day. The patterns of breathing and occasional movement marked the presence of life continuing through the darkness hours. The village rested as it had rested on countless nights before this one in the long past. The night would eventually give way to dawn and the cycle would begin again as it always did. Sleeping continued through the hours as darkness covered the village and surrounding fields completely without any light. The rest allowed bodies to heal and restore energy that had been spent working in the fields. The stillness was broken only by the soft sounds of breathing and occasional animal calls from the distance. The village was at peace during these hours when work had stopped entirely for all people. The peace of night was necessary for the continuation of life in this place along the canals. Water in storage jars waited to be used when morning came and activities resumed throughout the settlement. The water had been carried from the canals during the day just passed earlier by household members. It would be used for washing and cooking and drinking when people woke from sleep in the morning. The water was essential and always needed in quantities that required constant replenishment from the canal sources. The jars held enough water to last through the night until morning fetching would begin once again. Fires reduced to coals glowed faintly in the darkness, providing minimal light and warmth as needed. The coals would be used to restart fires in the morning when cooking would begin for the day. The banking of fires conserved fuel while maintaining the potential for easy rekindling later when it was needed. The skill of fire management was known to all and practiced daily without conscious thought about the process. The fires rested as the people rested, waiting for the new day to arrive with the sunrise. Grain stored in sealed containers waited to be ground into flour tomorrow morning when work would resume. The grain represented the harvest from fields worked throughout the growing season just past before this time. It would sustain families through the months until the next harvest came around again in the cycle. The storage of grain was critical for survival during periods between harvests when nothing new was growing. The containers protected the grain from spoilage and loss that would mean hunger later for the families. Clothing lay folded or hung in homes ready to be worn when people rose from their sleep. The garments had been made by hand from plant fibers or wool processed over many hours of work. They would be put on in the morning as part of the daily routine followed by all people. The clothing protected bodies from sun while remaining light enough for the warm climate experienced in this region. The simple garments served their purpose without decoration or unnecessary complexity added to their making. Baskets and containers held various household items stored for daily use when they would be needed tomorrow. The baskets had been woven from reeds gathered along the canals and prepared carefully for this use. They would be used tomorrow for carrying, storing, and organizing items throughout the day as they were always. The baskets wore out from constant use and were replaced regularly by new ones that were woven. The skill of basket making was possessed by nearly everyone in the community living here together. The village slept on as the night progressed slowly toward the dawn hours that would come ahead. The rest continued uninterrupted for most people lying on their mats in homes clustered together in the settlement. The sleep was deep and restorative, allowing full recovery from the physical demands made during the daylight. The night protected the sleeping village with its darkness and relative coolness compared to the heat of day. The hours passed unmarked by most who slept through them, unaware of their passage through the darkness. Morning would come as it always came, bringing light and the resumption of work and daily activities. The sun would rise over the canals and people would wake to begin their tasks once more. The pattern would repeat as it had repeated yesterday and the day before that in the past. The work would be done and the meals would be eaten and evening would come again. The cycle would turn again and again without end as far as could be seen into future. The canals would flow and the fields would be tended and the animals would graze as they always did. Bread would be baked and water would be carried and children would grow older with each passing day. Seasons would change and years would pass and generations would succeed one another over the long time. The village would continue and the patterns would be maintained through the collective effort sustained by all members. Life would go on as it had gone on for longer than anyone could remember from the distant past. The night continued through its darkest hours as the village rested in complete stillness throughout the settlement. The breathing of sleepers was slow and steady, creating barely audible sounds in the darkness surrounding all homes. Bodies lay on sleeping mats arranged in the same positions used every night previously without any change. The stillness was broken only by occasional sounds from animals or distant night creatures outside the settlement. The hours of deepest night passed slowly while people slept, unaware of time moving forward through the darkness. Dawn would eventually arrive, bringing light and the beginning of another day of similar activities as before. The pattern would repeat as it had countless times before in this place along the canals flowing. People would rise and begin their work according to familiar routines known to all of the members. The day would unfold in predictable ways shaped by the season and the work required at that time. The cycles would continue turning as they had for generations before this current time and people living. The daily rhythm of life was shaped by the sun's movement across the sky from east to west. Morning brought cool air and the beginning of work in fields and households throughout the entire settlement. Midday brought heat and a necessary pause in physical labor to avoid exhaustion from exertion in the heat. Afternoon saw the resumption of work as temperatures decreased toward evening and sunset time approaching steadily. Evening brought the completion of work and preparation for rest during the night ahead in the darkness. Seasonal rhythms overlaid the daily patterns, creating larger cycles through the year ahead in predictable succession. The flood season brought water that renewed fields and made agriculture possible in this region where it was dry. Planting season followed as water receded and fields became accessible for working once more after the flooding. Growing season required constant attention to crops as they developed toward eventual harvest time when they were ready. Harvest season brought intense work gathering crops before storage for the months ahead until next planting season. The annual cycle of seasons repeated year after year with only minor variations that were observed. The timing of the flood was generally predictable, though the exact dates varied somewhat from year to year. The amount of water deposited on fields changed from year to year, affecting crop yields that were obtained. The community adapted to these variations through experience accumulated over many generations of living here in this place. The relationship with the canals and their cycles was central to survival and prosperity in the region. Generational cycles saw the replacement of older people with younger ones over time passing through the years. Children grew to adulthood and formed their own families following patterns they had observed and learned from elders. Adults aged and eventually became elders who contributed wisdom rather than physical labor to the community around them. Elders eventually died and were replaced by the next generation, moving through the same stages of life. The continuity of community was maintained through this constant cycle of birth, growth, and death over time. Knowledge passed from generation to generation through observation and participation in daily work activities performed regularly. Children learned by watching and gradually taking on tasks under the guidance of experienced adults around them. The learning was informal but effective in transmitting the skills needed for survival here in this region. Each generation learned what the previous generation had learned before them in similar ways without formal schooling. The knowledge accumulated over many generations and was refined through countless repetitions of work and daily living. The community maintained itself through the collective labor of all its capable members together working toward survival. Each person contributed according to their abilities and received support when their abilities diminished with age or illness. The reciprocal relationships between households created networks of mutual aid and support over time in the community. No single household could survive in isolation from the others in the community around them here. The social bonds were strengthened through daily interactions and exchanges of goods and assistance offered to each other. Trade connected communities along the canals and allowed exchange of goods not produced locally in each settlement. Boats carried products from one area to another, creating economic connections between distant places along the waterways. Markets provided locations where individuals could exchange surplus production for needed items they lacked at that time. The trade networks were essential for obtaining materials and goods not available in the immediate area surrounding settlements. The economic relationships were part of the larger pattern of community life and survival here in this region. Religious practices connected communities with forces beyond their direct control or understanding completely at that time. Offerings and rituals expressed gratitude and sought favor from deities believed to influence outcomes in the natural world. The practices were performed regularly according to traditions passed down through many generations before this current time. Priests served specialized functions, maintaining temples and performing ceremonies for the community members living nearby regularly. The religious life was woven into daily activities rather than separated from ordinary work and life. The canals remained the central feature of life in this region throughout all seasons that passed each year. Water from the canals made agriculture possible in an otherwise dry landscape around the settlements built here. The canals provided transportation, allowing movement of goods and people between distant communities efficiently along their length. Fish from the canals supplemented the grain-based diet with protein and variety in the meals eaten. Reeds and plants from the canals provided materials for countless purposes in daily life and work activities. Fields stretched along the canals on land made fertile by water and periodic flooding that occurred naturally. The fields were worked by many people cooperating to plant, tend, and harvest crops together in groups. The produce from fields fed the community and provided surplus for trade with others in distant settlements. The fields required constant attention throughout the growing season to ensure successful harvests would result from the work. The agricultural cycle structured the year and determined the rhythm of community life here in this place. Homes provided shelter from sun and occasional rain for families living in the village settlements throughout the region. The homes were built from materials available locally, including mud bricks, reeds, and wood that was gathered. Maintenance of homes was ongoing work required to keep them functional and protective over time as they aged. The interior spaces were simple, containing only essential items needed for daily living activities by the families. The homes reflected practical needs rather than desires for comfort or display of wealth or status. Tools enabled the work that sustained the community through agricultural and craft production activities performed by all members. The tools were simple but effective for the purposes they served in the daily work that was done. Maintenance of tools was essential to keep them functional for the work they were designed to perform. Proper care extended the useful life of tools, which had value to those who used them regularly. The tools were made from materials available locally or obtained through trade with others in different areas. Clothing protected bodies from sun while remaining light enough for the warm climate experienced in this region. The production of clothing required substantial time, from processing fibers through the final garments that were made. Clothing wore out from use and sun exposure, requiring regular replacement of items over the passing time. Each household produced the clothing needed for its members through women's labor devoted to this important work. The clothing was simple and functional rather than decorative in most cases for most people living here. Food preparation occupied significant portions of women's time throughout every day without exception or variation from routine. Grinding grain into flour was the most labor-intensive part of food preparation that was performed. Bread baking occurred daily, providing the primary food consumed by all community members regularly without fail. Other foods supplemented bread, but grain remained the foundation of the diet for everyone in the settlement. The work of food preparation was essential and could not be neglected or postponed safely without consequences. Water management was critical for both household needs and agricultural production in this dry region of land. Canals brought water from the rivers to fields where crops grew during the growing season each year. Household water was carried from the canals in jars by women and children daily without stopping. The water was too precious to waste and too essential to neglect in any way at all. Access to clean water determined health outcomes and agricultural success for communities living here along the waterways. Children represented the future of the community and were raised with care and attention by all members. They learned through participation in daily work alongside adults from whom they learned necessary skills over time. Play provided opportunities for physical development and social learning among children of similar ages living nearby. Children were valued as the next generation who would continue the community into the future ahead. The raising of children was shared among family members and broader community networks together in this place. Elders provided wisdom based on accumulated experience over many decades of living and working in this region. Their knowledge guided decisions about timing of planting, methods of work, and solutions to problems that arose. Their presence in households provided stability and connection to earlier generations who had lived before them. The elders were respected and cared for when they could no longer contribute physical labor to the work. The wisdom of elders was valued as essential to the community's functioning and survival over the long time. Health was maintained through adequate food, clean water, rest, and avoidance of injury when this was possible. Illness was treated with remedies made from plants and minerals according to traditional knowledge that was passed. Recovery from illness was not guaranteed, and many people died from diseases that could not be cured. Injuries from work or accidents could have lasting effects on a person's ability to contribute labor to community. The relationship between health and survival was direct and understood by everyone in the community living here. Death was part of life and was understood as a transition rather than an ending of existence entirely. Funerary practices prepared the deceased for their journey to the afterlife according to beliefs that were held. Mourning periods allowed families to grieve while maintaining the work necessary for survival of the living members. The memory of the deceased was preserved through offerings and stories told about them over time passing. Death removed individuals, but the community continued through the surviving members who remained behind to carry on. Festivals marked important points in the agricultural and religious calendar throughout the year that passed ahead. The festivals provided breaks from ordinary labor and opportunities for community gathering and celebration together in groups. Special foods were prepared and consumed during festivals that were not available during ordinary times throughout the year. The festivals reinforced social bonds and provided something to anticipate during routine periods of daily work. Participation in festivals was both religious duty and social necessity for community members living here together. The patterns of life continued day after day with only minor variations from the established daily routines. The sameness provided stability and predictability that allowed the community to function effectively over time passing forward. Each day was similar to the previous day and to the day that would follow tomorrow ahead. The work was familiar and the outcomes were generally predictable based on past experience that was accumulated. The continuity of patterns was valued more than novelty or change in most circumstances here in this place. The work of maintaining the community required effort from all capable members throughout the year without stopping. No single person could provide everything needed for survival in this environment alone without help from others. Families cooperated with each other, sharing labor for tasks requiring multiple people to complete successfully together. The cooperation extended beyond immediate family to include neighbors and more distant relatives living nearby in the settlement. The network of mutual support made survival possible where individual effort would have failed to sustain life. Storage of surplus production allowed communities to survive between harvest periods when no new food was growing. Large containers made of clay held grain protected from moisture and pests during the storage time. The containers were inspected regularly to ensure contents remained in good condition over time without spoiling. Proper storage techniques had been developed through experience over many generations of practice here in this region. The stored surplus represented security against poor harvests or unexpected losses of current crops that could occur. Irrigation systems brought water from the canals to fields located at various distances away from the water source. The channels required regular maintenance to keep them clear and functioning properly for water delivery to the crops. Workers cooperated to maintain channels that served multiple fields belonging to different families together in the settlement. The shared irrigation infrastructure required collective effort to build and maintain over time successfully without failing. Water management was too important to be left to individual households acting alone separately from each other. Craft production created items needed by the community but not produced through agriculture directly from the fields. Potters made containers essential for storage, cooking, and transport of various materials needed daily by all families. Weavers produced cloth used for clothing and household textiles by all families in the community living here. Basket makers created containers used for countless purposes in daily life and work activities performed by everyone. The craftsmen traded their products for food produced by farmers in mutually beneficial exchanges that sustained both. Boat building required specialized skills developed over years of practice and observation of experienced builders working with materials. The boats were essential for transportation and trade along the canals connecting distant communities together in networks. Different boat designs served different purposes, from fishing to cargo transport to passenger movement efficiently along the waterways. The boats were maintained carefully to extend their useful life in service to the community's needs. Boat builders occupied an important position in the economic life of canal communities here in this region. Fishing provided protein that supplemented the grain-based diet consumed by most people regularly throughout the year. Different fishing techniques were used depending on the season and the species being sought from the canals. The knowledge of where and when to fish was passed from experienced fishermen to apprentices learning the trade. Fresh fish was consumed quickly, while excess catch was preserved through drying for later consumption when needed. Fishing was less central than agriculture but still contributed importantly to food security for the communities living here. Hunting supplemented the food supply in areas where game remained accessible to hunters from the villages here. The hunting required knowledge of animal behavior and skill with weapons developed through practice over many years. Meat from hunting was shared among participants and their families according to established customs known to all. Hunting was less reliable than agriculture or fishing as a food source in most areas of the region. The contribution of hunting to diet varied depending on location and availability of game animals in the area. Gardens near homes produced vegetables and herbs that added variety to grain-dominated meals that were eaten. The gardens received careful attention from women and children who maintained them as daily responsibility without fail. Fresh vegetables were valued for the different tastes and textures they provided in otherwise monotonous diet consumed. The gardens required water carried from the canals and constant attention to protect from pests eating the plants. Garden production was small-scale but meaningful in improving the quality of meals consumed by the families. Date palms grew in some areas, providing fruit valued for its sweetness in the diet consumed daily. The fruit was eaten fresh or dried for storage and use throughout the year when it was needed. Trees required years to mature but then produced reliably for many seasons afterward without much additional care. The fruit was sweet and energy-dense, making it valuable in the diet of people living here. Trees were planted by families and remained productive for future generations to use after the original planters. Sesame and flax were grown in fields and processed for oil used in cooking and other purposes. The seeds were crushed using heavy stones that pressed out the valuable oil they contained within them. The oil was collected carefully and stored in sealed containers for gradual use over extended time. Oil lamps provided light during evening hours, allowing some activity after sunset when it was needed. The oil was precious and used carefully to avoid waste of this limited resource that was available. Beer brewing preserved grain in liquid form and created a beverage consumed throughout the day by all people. The brewing process was understood by most women who made beer regularly in their households without formal instruction. Beer provided calories and was often safer to drink than water from uncertain sources in the region. The brewing was integrated into weekly routines along with other food preparation tasks performed regularly without exception. Beer was consumed by all ages as a staple beverage rather than an occasional treat for special times. Metal working created tools and objects from copper and bronze through heating and shaping processes that were complex. The metal was expensive and metal items were owned primarily by those of higher status in society. Most tools used by farmers remained made of stone, wood, or bone rather than costly metal. Metal workers occupied a specialized position in the community due to their rare skills that were possessed. The products of metal working were valued but not accessible to all community members equally in the settlement. Leather working transformed animal hides into durable goods used for various purposes by households in the community. The hides were cleaned and treated with substances that preserved them and made them workable for further use. Leather goods included sandals, bags, and other items valued for durability over time in regular use. The leather working required skills developed over years of practice and observation of experienced workers doing this. Leather goods were more expensive than plant fiber alternatives but lasted longer with proper care given to them. Scribal work created records needed for temple administration and government functions in larger centers of population nearby. Scribes trained for many years learning the complex writing system used for record keeping of various information. The training required memorization of hundreds of symbols and their proper usage in texts that were written. Scribes worked for temples, government officials, or wealthy families keeping accounts and records that were needed. The position of scribe provided status and security not available to agricultural workers in the fields outside. Administrative functions coordinated the collection of taxes and organization of large-scale projects requiring many workers together. Officials recorded contributions and organized labor for building projects and canal maintenance work that was needed. The administrative system allowed coordination across multiple communities for shared purposes and goals that were identified. The system required literacy and numerical skills possessed by relatively few people in communities overall living here. The administrative structure was part of the larger political organization of the region that was governed from centers. The land was worked by those who lived on it and depended on its productivity for their survival. Fields were not owned individually but were allocated to families for their use over time periods determined. The allocation of land was managed by community leaders or officials according to established customs that were followed. The relationship to land was based on use and stewardship rather than absolute ownership claimed privately by individuals. The land use patterns had developed over generations and were generally accepted by all participants in the system. Buildings and infrastructure were maintained through collective effort rather than individual responsibility alone that was carried. Irrigation canals served multiple fields and required cooperation to build and maintain over time passing through the years. Temples and public buildings were constructed through organized labor contributed by many community members together working. The collective infrastructure supported the community's functioning and could not have been created by individuals acting alone. The maintenance of shared infrastructure was ongoing work requiring continued cooperation from all benefiting members of the community. Health and well-being depended on adequate nutrition, clean water, and avoidance of accidents when this was possible. Medical knowledge was limited and many illnesses could not be effectively treated with available remedies that were known. Infant and child mortality was high and life expectancy was shorter than in later periods of time. The acceptance of death as natural was necessary given the limitations of medical intervention available then to people. The community supported those who were ill or injured but could not always prevent death from occurring naturally. The daily experience of most people was shaped by physical labor performed in fields and homes throughout the day. The work was repetitive and physically demanding, requiring strength and endurance from those performing it regularly without rest. Rest periods were necessary but limited to what was required for recovery and continued work afterward. The relationship between work and survival was direct and understood by everyone participating in it daily. The necessity of work structured daily life and left little time for leisure or recreation activities beyond this. Food security depended on successful harvests and proper storage of surplus for lean periods between growing seasons. Years with good harvests allowed communities to build reserves for harder times ahead in the future. Poor harvests meant rationing of food and increased reliance on supplementary sources like fish from the canals. No single year determined survival, but patterns over multiple years created security or hardship for the communities. Planning and careful management were essential for maintaining food supplies throughout the year without running out. Clothing production required significant time and effort from processing fibers through final garments that were made. The process included growing or gathering materials, processing them into fibers, spinning thread, and weaving into fabric. Additional time was spent cutting and assembling garments for family members to wear in daily activities. Clothing wore out from use and sun exposure, requiring regular replacement of items as they deteriorated. Each household devoted substantial labor to maintaining adequate clothing for all members throughout the seasons that passed. Shelter maintenance required ongoing attention to prevent deterioration of mud, brick, and wood structures over time. Rain could erode mud walls if not properly maintained with fresh applications of new mud material. Wood deteriorated from insects and weather, requiring periodic replacement of damaged pieces that had failed. Roofs needed regular attention as reeds decayed and mud layers eroded away from exposure to elements. The work of maintaining shelter was never fully completed but only kept at manageable levels through constant effort. Water management was critical for both household needs and agricultural production in the region where it was dry. The canals that brought water to fields required regular clearing of accumulated silt that blocked the flow. Household water storage needed cleaning to prevent contamination and maintain quality for use in daily activities. Access to clean water determined health outcomes and agricultural success for communities near the canals flowing through. Water was too precious to waste and too essential to neglect in any way at all here. Fire management was an essential skill requiring constant attention to prevent accidents and conserve fuel that was gathered. Fires were started using friction methods or transferred from existing fires nearby when this was possible. The fire was fed carefully to maintain necessary heat without consuming excessive fuel supplies that were limited. At night, fires were banked to preserve coals for easier relighting in morning hours when cooking began. Uncontrolled fire was dangerous to structures and stored food supplies in homes throughout the settlement areas. Animal husbandry required daily attention to feeding, watering, and monitoring health of livestock kept by households. Animals that became ill or injured needed treatment or removal from herds quickly to prevent spreading. Breeding was managed to maintain and improve quality of animals over time through generations of selection. Young animals required additional care until they could feed and protect themselves adequately on their own. The investment in animals paid returns in milk, meat, labor, and trade value for the families. Grain processing consumed enormous amounts of women's labor throughout every year without pause or variation from routine. The grinding required for daily bread took hours each day to produce sufficient flour for the needs. The repetitive motion caused physical wear on bodies performing this essential task daily without rest or break. Various methods were tried to make grinding more efficient, but technology remained simple in this time. The labor could not be avoided as bread was the primary food source for all people. Bread baking required skill to judge proper dough consistency and baking time for results that were desired. Ovens had to be heated to correct temperature using experience as the guide for this process. Bread could burn or remain undercooked if attention wandered during the process itself being performed. The timing of baking coordinated with other tasks that needed completion during the day's work schedule. Fresh bread was preferred, but stale bread was consumed rather than wasted from household supplies that were available. Beer brewing provided a way to preserve grain and create a nutritious beverage simultaneously for consumption. The process was understood and practiced widely among women in most households regularly without formal teaching. Beer was consumed with meals and throughout the day by all family members without restriction or limit. The beverage provided calories and some nutrients not available from bread alone in the diet consumed. Brewing was integrated into weekly routines along with other food preparation tasks needed for the households. Honey collection was seasonal work that required careful timing and proper techniques for success in gathering. The beekeeper watched for signs that honey was ready for harvest from established hives that were kept. Smoke was used to calm bees while honey was carefully removed from hives without destroying them. Some honey was always left to ensure bees could survive and continue production in future seasons. The sweet substance was valued highly and used sparingly in special preparations only when it was needed. Fish provided valuable protein, especially during seasons when other foods were less available from the fields. Fishermen developed knowledge of where and when fish were most likely to appear in the canals. Different techniques were used depending on water conditions and species being sought from the canal waters. Fresh fish was consumed quickly while excess catch was preserved through drying or salting for later use. Fishing complemented agricultural production in providing diverse food sources for communities over the year that passed. Pottery production created essential containers for storage, cooking, and transport of various materials needed by all families. The craft required knowledge of clay sources, preparation methods, and firing techniques learned over many years. Different vessel shapes served specific purposes understood by potters and their customers alike in the community. Broken pottery was common but could often be repaired or repurposed for continued use in households. The demand for pottery was constant as vessels wore out and broke regularly from daily use. Weaving transformed plant fibers into cloth used for clothing and household textiles throughout the year without stopping. The process was time-consuming but necessary to provide adequate cloth for families living in the settlement. Different weaving patterns created fabrics suited to different purposes and climate conditions experienced in this region. Cloth was valuable and cared for carefully to extend its useful life as long as possible. Worn cloth was cut into strips for various secondary uses before being discarded finally when unusable. Tool maintenance ensured that implements remained functional for the work they were intended to perform each day. Sharp edges were maintained through regular resharpening using available techniques and materials at hand for this. Handles were checked for cracks and replaced before they broke during use and caused injury to workers. Tools were stored properly to protect them from weather and damage when not in use by workers. The value of tools made their care a priority for anyone who depended on them for work. Basket making was a skill possessed by nearly everyone to some degree of competence in the community. Simple baskets could be made by most adults while complex forms required specialized skill from experienced makers. The materials were readily available and could be gathered as needed from nearby locations along the canals. Baskets filled many purposes and wore out quickly, requiring constant replacement in households over time passing. The ability to make baskets was taught to children as essential practical knowledge for their future lives. Cordage creation provided rope and twine necessary for countless purposes in daily life there in the settlement. The twisting of fibers strengthened them and created flexible, strong material for many uses in work. Different thicknesses were created depending on the intended use of the finished cordage product being made. Rope was subject to wear and eventually failed, requiring regular production of replacements for continued use. The skill was common and practiced regularly by many people in communities living along the canals. The sun moved across the sky each day in patterns that had been observed for countless generations. The changing angle of sunlight marked the progression of hours from morning through afternoon to evening time. Shadows lengthened as the day advanced toward evening and the approaching night that would follow darkness. The predictable movement of the sun provided structure to the day's activities and tasks performed by all. People worked in rhythm with the sun's position rather than by artificial timekeeping methods that were available. Midday brought the strongest heat and the brightest light to the villages and fields surrounding them here. Work slowed during this period as the heat made physical labor more difficult to sustain without rest. People sought shade and rest during the hottest hours of the afternoon period each day without exception. Water was consumed more frequently during midday to replace what was lost through perspiration occurring from the heat. The pause in activity during midday was understood as necessary for health and safety of all workers. Afternoon work resumed as the heat began to diminish with the sun's descent toward the western horizon. The cooler air made physical labor more tolerable for those working in fields and at other tasks. Tasks that had been set aside during midday were taken up again and continued toward completion before evening. The afternoon period was productive as people worked steadily toward completing the day's goals before darkness arrived. The approaching evening provided motivation to finish necessary work before darkness would end the working day. Field work in the afternoon involved checking irrigation channels and adjusting water flow as needed for the crops. Plants were inspected for signs of pests or disease that required attention or treatment to prevent spreading damage. Weeds that had been missed in earlier work were removed by hand from around the growing plants. The condition of crops was assessed and noted for future reference and planning of work that was needed. Each field received attention according to its specific needs and the crops growing there at that time. Animal care continued throughout the afternoon as herds returned from grazing areas to enclosures near the settlement. The animals were counted to ensure none had been lost during the day's grazing in the surrounding areas. Water troughs were filled and feed was provided for animals in their enclosures for the coming night. Young animals were checked for signs of illness or injury that needed treatment from those caring for them. The daily routine of animal care was performed consistently to maintain herd health over time without fail. Craft work continued in workshops and open areas as the afternoon hours passed toward evening approaching the settlement. Potters shaped additional vessels and set them aside to dry before firing would occur much later in kilns. Weavers worked at their looms making steady progress on cloth being produced for various uses that were planned. Basket makers gathered and prepared materials for the next day's work ahead that would need these supplies. The afternoon was productive time for craftsmen working on their various projects consistently without rushing the work being done. Women continued food preparation work that had begun earlier in the day throughout the afternoon hours. Ingredients were prepared for the evening meal that would be consumed after sunset when work had ended. Dough was set aside to rise before being shaped and baked later in the cooling evening air. Vegetables were cleaned and cut ready for cooking when the time came for meal preparation to begin. The work of preparing food occupied significant portions of each day for most women in the households here. Children returned from their play and began helping with afternoon tasks as directed by the adults. They carried water, gathered fuel, or performed other simple tasks assigned to them by household members. Older children took on more responsibility and worked alongside adults learning through practice and direct observation. The participation of children in household work was expected and considered normal training for their future roles. Their contributions, though modest, were valued as part of the household's collective effort to sustain itself properly. Elders sat in shaded areas during afternoon discussing matters of interest to the community and its members. Their conversations covered past experiences, current concerns, and observations about village life in general and specific matters. Younger people sometimes listened to gain knowledge from the accumulated wisdom of older generations who had lived. The elders' perspective was valued and their opinions were considered in community decisions when these were needed. The afternoon gathering of elders was a regular feature of village life and the established social structure. The marketplace in larger towns remained active through the afternoon as people completed exchanges with each other. Those who had traveled from distant villages conducted their business before beginning the return journey home. Final negotiations were completed and goods changed hands according to agreed-upon terms between the parties involved. The market would empty gradually as the afternoon advanced toward evening and closing time for the day. Merchants packed remaining goods and prepared to return to their homes nearby in the surrounding settlements. Boats continued moving on the canals throughout the afternoon carrying goods between communities along the water's length. The crews worked steadily loading and unloading cargo at various stopping points along the route they traveled. The canal traffic was constant as trade moved materials to where they were needed most in different settlements. Boat crews called to each other as they passed, sharing brief news or greetings while traveling the waterways. The canals served as a highway connecting all communities along their length together in networks of trade. Temple activities continued through the afternoon as priests performed required rituals and duties that were scheduled. Offerings were made at prescribed times according to religious calendar and tradition observed by the community. Records were kept of temple business, inventories, and transactions completed during the day that had passed. The temple compound remained a center of activity distinct from but connected to village life surrounding it. The priests worked within their specialized roles, serving religious and administrative functions for the community living nearby. Scribes continued their work of recording information on materials prepared for writing purposes throughout the afternoon. They copied texts, recorded transactions, or drafted documents as directed by those employing them for this work. The work required concentration and precision to ensure accuracy of the records being created for future reference. Scribes sat in positions that allowed good light to fall on their work surfaces during the day. Their training and skill made them valuable to those who required documentation services regularly for their activities. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across fields and through villages as it descended toward the horizon. The quality of light changed, becoming softer and less harsh than midday brightness had been earlier. Colors appeared different in the angled light of late afternoon than at other times during the day. The changing light signaled the approaching transition from day to evening and coming night that would follow. People became aware that the day's work needed completion before darkness arrived soon and ended visibility. Final field work of the day involved securing tools and preparing to return to homes in the settlement. Tools were cleaned of dirt and stored in designated locations for the next day's use in the fields. Irrigation channels were checked one last time to ensure water would flow properly overnight to the crops. The fields were surveyed quickly to note any issues that would require attention tomorrow when work resumed. Workers gathered their belongings and began walking back toward the village in small groups along familiar paths. Fishing crews returned to shore with their catches from the afternoon's work on the canal waters. The fish were unloaded and quickly distributed or prepared for preservation by drying in the remaining sunlight. Nets were checked for damage and repairs were made or scheduled for next day when work resumed. Boats were secured at their mooring locations along the canal bank for the night ahead in darkness. The fishermen cleaned their equipment and prepared to return to their homes nearby in the settlement areas. Herds were moved into enclosures as the sun approached the horizon in the west for the evening. Gates were closed and secured to prevent animals from wandering during the night when no one watched. Final counts were made to ensure all animals were accounted for and safely enclosed for the darkness. Feed and water were checked to ensure animals had adequate supplies for the night that was coming. The work of securing animals was completed as part of the evening routine daily without fail. Women began the final cooking preparations for the evening meal as the day ended and darkness approached. Fires were built up to provide heat for cooking the prepared ingredients that had been gathered earlier. Pots were placed over fires and their contents were monitored as they cooked slowly over the flames. Bread was removed from ovens and set aside to cool before being served to the family members. The smell of cooking food spread through the village, signaling that mealtime approached soon for all households. Children were called to come and prepare for the evening meal with their families in their homes. They washed their hands and faces using water provided for this purpose before eating the meal together. Younger children were helped by older siblings or parents to ensure they were ready for the meal. The children gathered near where the meal would be served, waiting for food to be distributed to them. Their day of play and work was ending as the evening routine began predictably as it always did. Men returned from fields and washed away the dirt and dust accumulated during the day's work performed. Water was used sparingly but adequately to clean hands, faces, and feet before meals were consumed. Clean garments were put on if available, or dirty ones were brushed of loose dirt and debris. The transition from work to rest was marked by these simple cleaning rituals that were performed. Men gathered with their families as the evening meal was prepared nearby for serving to all members. Elders took their customary places for the evening meal with family members around them in the dwelling. They were served first as a sign of respect for their age and status within the household. The food was passed from the elders to younger members in established order that was followed. Conversations began quietly as people settled into the familiar routine of the evening meal together in the group. The gathering together of family marked the end of the workday clearly for all members present. The evening meal was eaten slowly as there was no rush to finish the food provided. The food was simple but adequate to satisfy hunger after the day's work that had been performed. Portions were distributed fairly according to the needs of each family member present at the meal. Quiet conversations continued throughout the meal on topics related to the day's events that had occurred. The meal provided both nutrition and social connection at the end of each day for the families. Cleanup after the meal was completed efficiently by those designated for this task in the household. Dishes were washed using water heated over the fire or used cold if fuel was scarce. Food scraps were set aside for animals or disposed of appropriately away from the home in designated areas. Cooking implements were cleaned and stored in their usual locations ready for tomorrow's use when cooking resumed. The work of cleanup transitioned the household toward preparing for sleep and rest during the night. Fires were reduced to coals that would smolder through the night, providing some warmth if it was needed. The bright flames were allowed to die down as there was no further need for cooking heat. A small amount of light remained from the glowing coals in the darkness of the evening. The fire would be rebuilt in the morning using these preserved coals as starting material for the day. Fire management was a constant responsibility from morning lighting to evening banking of the coals nightly. Stories might be told briefly as families sat together before preparing for sleep in their homes. The stories were familiar ones heard many times before by all those listening to the telling. The telling reinforced shared knowledge and cultural values through repeated exposure to the narratives over time. Children listened quietly even though they knew the stories well from previous tellings they had heard. The storytelling was brief as everyone was tired from the day's work and ready for rest. Sleeping arrangements were made by unrolling mats and positioning them in usual locations inside the homes. Each person had an established place where they slept each night without variation from the pattern. Light coverings were gathered and placed nearby for use if needed during the night hours ahead. Children settled near parents or siblings in arrangements that provided comfort and security during the darkness. The household prepared for sleep as darkness deepened outside the home completely now for the night. The village became quiet as families settled into their homes for the night ahead in darkness. The sounds of daytime activity faded away, leaving only occasional noises from animals outside the dwellings. Most people lay on their sleeping mats resting after the long day of work that had ended. The darkness was complete except for faint glows from banked fires in some homes still burning. Sleep came naturally to bodies tired from physical labor performed throughout the day that had passed. Night sounds replaced the familiar daytime noises in the village and surrounding areas beyond the settlement. Insects chirped in steady rhythms that continued through the hours of darkness without pause or variation. Distant animals occasionally called or moved, creating brief sounds that carried through the still air outside. The canals continued flowing past, making soft sounds as water moved over rocks and through channels. These night sounds were familiar and did not disturb the sleep of most people resting peacefully. The air cooled gradually as the night progressed through its darkest hours toward dawn that would come. Light coverings were pulled closer by those who felt the change in temperature during sleep continuing. Bodies adjusted naturally to the cooler air without fully waking from rest that was needed. The night temperature was comfortable in most seasons, requiring little adjustment to sleeping arrangements made earlier. The cooling air was welcome after the heat of the day in warmer months of the year. Stars moved slowly across the sky in patterns that had been observed for generations of time. The positions of stars changed through the night as the Earth turned beneath them in space. Some people woke briefly and noticed the star positions before returning to sleep again in their homes. The stars provided markers of time's passage for those who understood their movements well through the sky. The night sky remained mostly unchanged from night to night in its basic appearance overhead. The moon rose or was absent depending on its cycle through the month that was passing. When present, the moon provided some light that filtered through doorways and openings in homes during darkness. The moonlight was sufficient to see shapes and movement if someone woke during the night hours. On moonless nights, the darkness was more complete and movement more difficult without artificial light sources. The moon's cycle was familiar and its absence or presence was expected accordingly by all people. Some people woke during the night for various reasons before returning to sleep once more again. A child might wake needing reassurance from a parent sleeping nearby on the mats laid out. An adult might rise to check on animals or adjust the fire if it was needed. These wakings were brief interruptions in the otherwise unbroken sleep of the night hours passing. Most people returned to sleep quickly after these brief periods of waking and activity during darkness. Dreams occurred during sleep, though they were not often remembered upon waking in the morning light. The content of dreams varied but was considered unimportant by most people in the communities here. Sleep was valued for the rest it provided rather than for dreams that might occur during it. Dreams faded quickly from memory once waking occurred in the morning light ahead of the day. The purpose of night was rest and recovery of strength for the coming day's work ahead. The deepest sleep occurred during the middle hours of the night for most people resting on mats. Breathing was slow and regular as bodies rested completely from the day's exertions in the fields. Movement was minimal during these hours of deep sleep and restoration of energy for tomorrow's work. The night provided essential rest that could not be obtained during waking hours of work and activity. Bodies repaired themselves and restored energy depleted by the previous day's labor during the sleep hours. Very young children slept through most of the night without waking in most cases of rest. Their small bodies required more sleep than adults to support their growth and development over time. Parents positioned themselves near young children to respond if they woke needing attention during the darkness. The sleep of children was deeper and longer than that of adults typically in the households. Children woke refreshed and ready for another day of play and learning ahead when morning came. Elderly people sometimes slept less soundly than younger adults during the night hours that passed by. They might wake more frequently or sleep for shorter total periods than others nearby on the mats. Age brought changes in sleep patterns that were accepted as natural and expected by all members. Elders rested during the day if nighttime sleep was insufficient for their needs and recovery required. The community understood that sleep patterns changed with age over the course of a lifetime lived. Animals in their enclosures also rested during the night hours, though not as deeply as people did. Cattle and goats lay down in their shelters chewing cud or simply resting quietly through the darkness. The animals stirred occasionally but generally remained calm and quiet through the night hours until morning. Their sounds were familiar to those sleeping nearby and did not cause concern or disturbance to the rest. The animals' rest prepared them for another day of grazing or work ahead tomorrow when light returned. Dogs kept by some families remained alert even during nighttime hours of rest in the settlement. They would bark if unfamiliar sounds or movements occurred near the village during darkness of the night. Their warnings alerted people to potential dangers from animals or other threats approaching nearby the homes. The dogs were valued for this protective function they provided to households and the community living here. Their presence allowed people to sleep more peacefully, knowing they would be alerted if it was needed. The hours passed slowly as the night progressed toward the time when dawn would arrive with light. The village remained quiet with only occasional sounds breaking the stillness of darkness completely surrounding it. Most people slept deeply, unaware of time's passage through the night hours stretching ahead into morning. The rest accumulated, gradually preparing bodies and minds for another day of similar activities and work. The night served its essential purpose of providing recovery time needed by all living things here. Pre-dawn hours brought the coolest temperatures of the entire day and night cycle combined together here. Additional coverings were used by those who felt the chill during these hours before sunrise would come. Bodies naturally conserved warmth by curling slightly and remaining still during sleep in the cold periods. The cool air was refreshing and made sleep deep and restorative for most people resting now. The temperature would rise again once the sun appeared over the horizon in the eastern direction. The first hints of dawn appeared as a faint lightening of the eastern sky above the settlement. The change was gradual and almost imperceptible at first to those still sleeping inside their homes. The stars began to fade as the sky slowly brightened with the approaching sunrise ahead of the day. Birds began calling softly as they sensed the coming of day and new light returning to the land. The transition from night to day had begun, though most people still slept peacefully in their dwellings. Some people began to wake as the pre-dawn light increased enough to penetrate their homes through openings. They stirred on their mats but did not yet rise to begin the day's work and tasks. The awakening was gradual, allowing the transition from sleep to waking to occur naturally and gently without rushing. Bodies became aware of the need to rise but remained at rest briefly longer before moving from sleep. The day would begin soon, but not quite yet in these quiet moments before full dawn. The patterns would repeat themselves as they had the previous day and before that time in memory. Work would be performed in fields and homes according to familiar routines known well to all participants. Meals would be prepared and consumed at customary times throughout the day ahead, as they were always. Animals would be tended and children would play in open areas between homes as they did every day. The day would unfold in ways that were predictable and understood by all community members living. The canals would continue flowing past the village as they always had for all memory of time. Water would be carried to homes and fields for the many purposes it served daily in the settlement. Boats would move on the water carrying goods between communities along its length as they did regularly. Fish would be caught and reeds would be harvested from marshy areas near the water's edge as needed. The canal's presence would shape the day as they shaped every day in this place along water.